The sound of gravel crunching under tires was the only thing that dared to break the breathless silence of that October morning in 1987. Social worker Margaret Chen had driven this lonely Kentucky back road many times before, yet something about today felt different. 3 days earlier, an anonymous tip had come through the state hotline. The words still circled in her mind like a moth against glass. There's something real wrong with the Whitaker kids up on Clover Lick Road. They can't hear nothing. And they look like something ain't right. Have you ever felt a warning in your bones before you even reach a place? Margaret did. Her state-issued Ford sedan rolled to a stop in front of what could barely be called a house. The structure sagged against the weight of years' wooden planks, soft with rot. The roof a patchwork of holes where shingles had long given up. But it wasn't the decay that made her stomach tighten. It was the silence. No children's laughter, no distant television, no barking dog, only the faint settling groan of a house that seemed to be listening back. Margaret had investigated neglect and abuse for over a decade. She thought she knew what to expect, but nothing had prepared her for Clover Lick Road. She gathered her clipboard and camera, drawing a slow breath before stepping onto the porch. There was no doorbell. Her knock against the weathered wood sounded far too loud in the empty morning. The door creaked open reluctantly, as if the house itself were deciding whether to allow her in. A woman stood there, 40s perhaps, but the years had carved themselves cruelly into her skin. Grey threaded through her hair like smoke. Her eyes, haunted. Eyes Margaret had only seen in those who had lived too long with pain. Mrs. Whitaker? Margaret held up her state identification. I'm Margaret Chen from Kentucky Child Protective Services. We received a call. The woman Betty Whitaker, as Margaret would later learn, simply stared. Blank, no nod, no flicker of recognition, as though the words had never reached her at all. Ma'am Margaret raised her voice, the porch boards cold beneath her shoes. Still nothing. Movement in the shadowed hallway caught her eye. A small figure emerged, and Margaret's breath faltered. A boy, no more than 8 years old. But something about him struck a primal chord of wrongness. His head was unnaturally large, nearly double what it should have been. His eyes, set too far apart, gave him a face that felt almost otherworldly. His mouth hung slack, revealing teeth cracked and mottled. And the way he moved, stumbling uncertain, was like someone exploring a world without one of their senses. He tugged at Betty's tattered dress, making rough, almost frantic hand motions. Not the graceful patterns of sign language Margaret knew enough to tell the difference, but a crude private language of the household. Is this your son? Margaret asked, though a cold suspicion had already taken root. Betty's lips moved, shaping words, but no sound escaped. Silent mouthings of a language Margaret could not catch. The air round them felt heavy, as if even sound itself refused to enter. Then it struck her. This wasn't merely quiet. This was absolute silence. A suffocating absence where life should echo. More children emerged from the dim interior. First a girl of perhaps 12, bearing the same strange features as the boy, eyes wide apart, head oddly swollen. Then another boy, maybe 10, dragging one leg behind him with a soft shuffle that seemed far too loud in the dead air. Finally, a teenager, 16, maybe his vacant gaze betraying an intellectual disability Margaret recognized instantly. One by one, they gathered, each communicating in those same unsettling gestures, each with the same distorted face. Each, and Margaret was now certain, utterly, completely deaf. Her training wrestled her shock into focus. 4 children, severe developmental disabilities, no sound, no suitable living conditions. She began to write her pen, scratching like an insect across paper. But as her hand moved, a darker thought whispered through her mind. A thought she could not yet name, but one that chilled her more than the October air ever could. The children did not merely share the same silence, they shared the same face, the same unsettling geometry of features, the wide-set eyes, the swollen skulls, the oddly shaped ears, like variations on a single distorted portrait. It was as if someone had pressed the same fragile clay again and again, shaping each child from the same ancestral mold. Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke, though she knew the woman before her could not hear. "Miss Whitaker," she said slowly, "these children, they all look like you." Betty Whitaker only blinked. Margaret pulled a sheet of paper from her clipboard, her pen scratching large, deliberate letters. "Are all these children yours?" Betty stared at the question for a long, silent moment. Then she nodded her head, bobbing with a sudden, almost eager energy. She gestured to each of the children, and then to herself, a faint smile breaking across her weathered face, the first sign of emotion since Margaret's arrival. Margaret wrote again. "Where is their father?" The smile faded. Betty's eyes darted toward the back of the house. Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. Margaret followed the direction of that nervous glance. From behind a leaning shed, an outhouse, perhaps, a man stepped into view, tall, thin. And as he drew nearer, Margaret felt the air around her tighten. The man's face carried the same unnatural architecture, the same wide eyes, the same misshapen skull. But there was something worse. Something that made her blood run cold. His features matched Betty's, not just generally, but specifically. The same nose, the same sharp chin, even the same peculiar tilt to the ears. They did not look like husband and wife. They looked related. Margaret's pen moved almost of its own accord. "Are you and your husband related?" Betty's eyes flicked to the words. Color drained from her face. The man reached the porch. The two began a frantic exchange of those crude private gestures, their motions sharper and more aggressive than before. The man suddenly lunged forward, snatching the paper from Margaret's hand and crushing it into a tight fist. His arm shot toward her car, an unmistakable command. Margaret steadied her breath. She had seen enough. Enough to fill a report. Enough to fuel a nightmare. 4 deaf children each with severe developmental disabilities. 2 parents themselves deaf, bearing an undeniable resemblance to one another. A house collapsing under poverty and isolation. And something else, something Margaret could not yet name, that made every instinct she had honed over 12 years of social work cry out in alarm. She retreated to her car, her mind racing as the family watched through the cracked window. 6 faces, 4 small, 2 adult pressed against the glass, identical in their haunting symmetry. All silent, all waiting, all staring as though they could somehow hear the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat. Margaret gripped the radio receiver. "Tom, it's Margaret," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I need backup, and we'll need medical evaluations for these children. Something is very, very wrong with this family." "What kind of wrong?" Her supervisor's voice crackled through the static. Margaret turned back toward the house to those 6 silent faces. "I don't know," she answered slowly. "But it's something we've never dealt with before. Run a background check on the Whitaker family, go back as far as you can. And Tom, call the health department. We're going to need a geneticist." As Margaret drove away from Clover Road, she had no way of knowing that she had brushed against the edge of a secret older than the house itself. The Whitakers' deafness was not chance, not disease, not an accident of birth. It was the inevitable harvest of 11 generations of deliberate systematic inbreeding, a lineage sealed off from the outside world for more than 200 years. Why would any family choose such a path? What belief could be strong enough to bind blood to blood across centuries? The investigation that began that grey October morning would unravel a tapestry of religious extremism, hidden marriages, and genetic manipulation that had survived unnoticed in the hills of rural Kentucky. And Margaret Chen, a woman who thought she had seen every form of human neglect, was about to learn that some families build their own private hells and guard them with silence. 3 days later, a small conference room inside the Kentucky Department for Community-Based Services filled with people who rarely shared the same air. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geneticist from the University of Louisville. Detective Ray Thompson of the Kentucky State Police. Tom Bradley, Margaret's supervisor. And Margaret herself, who had spent 72 restless hours unable to banish the image of those 6 faces at the broken window. Tom spread a manila folder across the table, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "What Margaret found isn't just child neglect," he said quietly. "It's something none of us have ever encountered." He unfolded a large sheet of paper, names, dates, lines looping back on themselves in dizzying repetition. "This," he continued, "is the Whitaker family tree. It goes back to 1785. And I warn you, it will turn your stomach." Dr. Martinez leaned in her clinical detachment, slowly eroding as her eyes followed the tangle of connections. Curiosity faded to confusion. Confusion to horror. "My God," she whispered, "this can't be right." "I'm afraid it is," Tom replied. "Church records, marriage licenses, birth certificates, census data, we checked it all. The Whitaker family has practiced systematic inbreeding for 11 generations." Margaret stared at the paper, struggling to comprehend the looping lines. Brothers marrying sisters, uncles marrying nieces, first cousins producing children who then married their own first cousins. Some relationships so close they defied any category at all. Detective Thompson cleared his throat. "Start from the beginning," he said. "How does something like this even start?" Tom pointed to the name at the very top of the twisted tree. "It begins with Jeremiah Whitaker, born in 1760 in Virginia. He was part of a religious sect called the Holy Brethren, a group that believed in preserving what they called pure bloodlines, claiming it kept them God's chosen people." "Holy Brethren," Dr. Martinez interrupted. I've never heard of them." That's because Tom said grimly, they were less a denomination and more a cult. They believed the outside world would dilute what they called their divine blood. So when Jeremiah Whittaker packed his family and in 1785 carried them up into the Kentucky hills to found a pure community, he did not arrive alone. Along with his wife Sarah came his 3 brothers and their wives. From the very first moment, the settlement was not a town so much as a single family, folded in on itself. Only 4 surnames ever mattered there, and the circle closed tighter with every generation. Jeremiah fathered 7 children with Sarah. And then, almost as if by design, those children were married to one another. His eldest son Samuel wed his sister Rebecca. His daughter Mary was paired with her brother Joshua. Isaac, the youngest, took his first cousin Elizabeth for his wife. Have you ever tried to follow a family line and found it turning back upon itself like a river that suddenly loops the wrong way? Margaret stared at the pedigree and felt that dizzying loop in her stomach. Dr. Martinez trained to think in genes, and probabilities began to do the math in her head. Even after 1 generation of this pattern, the genetic consequences were grave. After 2, they would be catastrophic. And then Tom turned another sheet of paper. The pattern did not stop. Siblings married siblings. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles married nieces. For 2 centuries, the Whittakers folded their family tighter and tighter, creating an isolated gene pool, and then, by deliberate choice, contaminating it again and again with the same blood. Detective Thompson asked the question that had been burning in the room since Margaret first told the story, why Margaret's answer was soft and stunned. Religious fanaticism, she said. She had read about groups like this, about the way belief can become law in a closed community. Tom nodded. The records they'd found painted the same picture each generation taught. They were God's chosen, instructed that to preserve the purity of the line was a holy duty. What outsiders might call deformity, they called trial proof of faith. Tom slid another paper across the table. A yellowed letter, dated 1923. Ezekiel Whittaker's handwriting, steady and fervent, bled the family creed across the page. Tom read aloud, voice low. My beloved son, remember always that we are the pure seed of Abraham, untainted by the corruption of the outside world. If the Lord sees fit to test our children with afflictions, it is only to strengthen our faith and prove our worthiness. We must never allow for foreign blood to poison our sacred lineage. The room grew quieter as the last line hung in the air. This was not ignorance, it was doctrine. A program of self-destruction, dressed as piety, carried forward for 11 generations. Dr. Martinez traced the family lines with a finger, working the painful puzzle into clarity. The pattern of deafness here is sadly predictable, she said finally. Given the level of inbreeding we're seeing, I'm surprised it took 11 generations to become universal. Generation 7 shows the first congenital deafness. By generation 9, perhaps half the children are born deaf. And now in generation 11, Betty and Ray Whittaker's children, every child is affected. Ray, Detective Thompson prompted. Tom checked his notes. Ray Whittaker, age 43. And here's the kicker, Tom said, and the words landed like a stone. He's not only Betty's husband, he is also her brother. Margaret felt the air go thin around her as the truth settled. Brother and sister, she repeated the phrase, tasting of something old, and wrong, Tom swallowed and went on, though his voice was barely more than a rasp. Ray and Betty are also first cousins. Their mothers were sisters, their fathers were brothers. They're related in multiple ways. Dr. Martinez's pen moved faster numbers and probabilities stacking across the page. The coefficient of inbreeding for those children, she murmured, would be... She hesitated, the clinical words striking with another kind of horror, higher than what we see in most laboratory mouse strains used for genetic research. Detective Thompson's reaction was blunt and stunned. So these children are more inbred than the most inbred lab animals we use for experiments. It was a sentence no one in that room wanted to hear. The scale of deliberate genetic damage measured not in mistakes, but in policy and belief was without easy precedent. Catastrophic, systematic, chosen. And beneath the sterile facts and the folded family trees, a quieter question trembled. What devotion, what fear, what doctrine had driven generation after generation to choose this for their children? How many wills must bend before a family's flesh remembers the punishment of piety? There are stories where if you just slow down and listen to the details, you will see a darkness that lasts for generations. This story begins in 1785, when a man named Jeremiah left the outside world to take his family deep into the wild mountains of Kentucky. He took not only his wife Sarah, but also 3 brothers and their wives. Their goal to create a pure community where the blood, in Jeremiah's words, would forever remain holy. Do you hear the shudder at the very thought? Margaret, who was digging through old documents, began to realize the horror of this story. In the beginning, in that community, there were only 4 families. Jeremiah and his wife had 7 children. But the grisly truth only came out when Tom, Margaret's colleague, pointed down the next branch of the family tree. The eldest son, Samuel, married his own sister Rebecca, daughter Mary married her brother Joshua, and the youngest son, Isaac, married his cousin. Can you imagine those children when they came of age were arranged to marry their own blood? Dr. Martinez stared at the chart, her eyes calculating. After just 2 generations, she whispered, this level of inbreeding will lead to unforeseen consequences. But things got much worse. Generation after generation, the marriages revolved around siblings, cousins even, uncles and nieces. They created a closed gene line, and then they destroyed it for over 200 years. But why? Inspector Thompson asked. What could make people do this? On purpose, Margaret replied softly, almost to herself, religious fanaticism. The scattered ancient records recorded that each generation of Whitakers had been taught that they were God's chosen race. Their blood in blind faith had to be kept pure, and any deformity was merely a test of faith. Tom pulled out a yellowed letter dated 1923. His voice dropped as he read, My dear son, always remember, we are the pure seed of Abraham, unsullied by the world. If God tests our descendants with disease, it is only to strengthen our faith. Never let foreign blood taint this sacred lineage. In the hushed room, each word felt like a stab. This was no longer ignorance. This was a systematic program spanning 11 generations, gradually leading the family into genetic destruction. Dr. Martinez continued to trace the family tree. Generation 7, the first cases of congenital deafness. Generation 9, nearly half of the children were born deaf. And by generation 11, where the current story takes place, All of Betty and Ray Whitaker's children were completely deaf. Ray is Betty's husband, the inspector asked. Tom nodded, then lowered his voice as if afraid he would hear. Not only her husband, but her real brother. Margaret felt her stomach tighten, but Tom didn't stop. Ray and Betty are cousins. Their parents were two pairs of brothers and sisters. The level of inbreeding among these children is higher than that of specially bred lab rats. Can you feel the chill creeping into each word? But deafness was only the beginning. Margaret recalled the image of the 4 children in the Whitaker house: abnormally large heads, widely spaced eyes, mental retardation. Dr. Martinez listed severe mental retardation, physical deformities, weak immune systems, prone to genetic diseases, short lifespan, poor fertility. Their existence is a miracle. Tom opened a thick file which recorded the children of previous generations. The mortality rate was terrible. In the 10th generation, only about 30% lived to adulthood, and most were severely deformed. But how did they keep it hidden for over 200 years? Inspector Thompson wondered. Margaret answered slowly, isolation. They lived in the remote mountains, no schools, no hospitals, no records. A closed world where everything became normal. It was only in the 1980s, when the soil was depleted, the game was depleted, and some members were forced to leave the mountains to sell their crafts, that the first signs of the situation leaked out. Someone saw the Whitaker children and sent an anonymous letter. The letter led Margaret here. Dr. Martinez placed his hand on the genealogy, his voice breaking. Each generation is worse than the last. By the 11th generation, we're not just talking about deafness. The brain, the immune system, the physical development. Everything is deformed. Those children are almost a different species created from these intentional marriages. The conference room fell silent. This was not just a story about child abuse or neglect. This was a 2-century-long genetic experiment disguised as keeping the bloodline pure, Tom said softly, his voice almost fading into the darkness. We think there might be other families. Margaret looked up, her heart stopping. Other families. Yes. History records at least 3 other families that came with Jeremiah to Kentucky: Hartwell Morrison and Blackwood. We haven't found them yet. Imagine this: somewhere in the mountains of Kentucky, there might still be children born in silence, carrying the legacy of hundreds of years of inbreeding. Children who will never hear their mother's voice, never know music, and never fully understand the world outside. What do we do now? Margaret asked. Go back to the Whitaker house, Tom replied. But this time, we'll bring doctors, geneticists, social workers. We'll document everything, provide medical care, and find out how many other families are living in this genetic hell. Margaret looked out the window where the normal world continued and thought about the 4 children she'd met just 3 days earlier. Silent creatures carrying the sins of 11 generations. Parents generation after generation have personally bound their children to that fate. All just to preserve what they call sacred bloodline. The Whitaker children were more than just deaf. They were a living, chilling testament to what happens when humans allow themselves to play with nature. Margaret came to understand that their silence was more than just a lack of sound. It was a deeper silence, the silence of souls stripped of their humanity in the womb. 2 weeks after her first visit, Margaret returned to the Whitaker house. It was a grey November morning. the sky heavy as if about to fall. This time she was not alone. In the passenger seat, Dr. Martinez, with his medical bag full of specialized equipment, stared silently ahead. Behind them, a van carried Tom Bradley, Detective Thompson, and 2 other social workers. They had spent hours preparing for this intervention, but they all knew no amount of planning could shield them from what they were about to see. When the convoy pulled up in front of the decaying house on Cloverlick Road, Margaret immediately noticed something different. The last time, the whole lot had been filled with an absolute silence, almost suffocating. But today, from behind the house came a strange sound, a slow, repetitive thumping, like something heavy, falling to the ground in a steady rhythm. "Did you hear that?" Dr. Martinez asked softly, rolling down the window. The sound wasn't exactly a hammering, but more like someone pounding something into the ground. It was the first sound Margaret had ever heard coming from the Whitaker property. And that made it all the more chilling. The front door swung open before they could get out of the car. Betty Whitaker appeared still in the same tattered dress, but her expression was different. More alert, more suspicious, as if she had been waiting there for a long time. "Miss Whitaker," Margaret said, holding up a large printed sheet of paper. "We have come to help your children. This is the doctor." Betty read the words quickly, then immediately raised her hand to signal. Margaret remembered the clumsy movements of the previous time, but today they were urgent, hurried, panicked. What was she afraid of? Then the children began to appear. This was the first time Dr. Martinez had seen with his own eyes the result of 11 generations of inbreeding. The eldest son, about 16 years old, stepped out first. The cold grey light of the morning made the deformities on his body even more obvious. His head was not only abnormally large, but also misshapen, his forehead protruding, obscuring his sunken eyes. His lower jaw was long and protruding, leaving his mouth open as if locked in an unconscious expression. But most frightening was his staggering gait, like someone who had never had a fully developed sense of balance. "Oh my God," Dr. Martinez said softly, almost to himself. Next came the 12-year-old girl, and the sight was even more heartbreaking. She dragged her left leg, each step struggling because of her severely deformed hip. Her curved spine made her look hunched over, much older than her age. Her hands, only 3 fingers on each side, trembling as she clung to the door frame. The third child, a 10-year-old boy, appeared in an even worse condition. His head was so swollen that it seemed his skinny neck could barely support it. His eyes were not only set too far apart, but also at different heights, creating a terrifyingly asymmetrical face. With each step, he had to put both hands against the wall to keep his balance. Finally, the youngest child, an 8-year-old boy. At first glance, Dr. Martinez understood why Margaret had been haunted by him since their first meeting. His skull no longer had a human shape. His eyes were cloudy, as if covered in a white mist, a sign of congenital cataracts. The limbs were short, disproportionate to the body, making the whole body look like a distorted statue. "How can they live?" Dr. Martinez asked quietly. "I don't know," Margaret whispered, "but we'll have to find out." The strange thumping from behind the house continued, this time accompanied by a deep, choked groan as if from the throat of a wounded animal. Dr. Martinez turned sharply to Margaret. "And the other children," she said, her voice tense. Before she could answer, Ray Whittaker stepped out from behind the house. In his hand was a large wooden mallet. His clothes were stained with mud and a dark liquid that Margaret didn't dare to guess. The daylight revealed Ray's face more clearly than before. The same large, misshapen head, the eyes set far apart as if drawn askew. But this time, there was something else that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. A look of spite and ferocity. His gaze was an undisguised threat. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, holding up a large piece of paper. "I am a doctor. I am here to help your children." Ray stared, then immediately gestured with his hands, as frantically as Betty. Those movements were like a language of their own, a world that had locked itself from the outside world. "Do you hear that? What is that thumping sound? And how many truths are waiting to be revealed behind that rotten wall?" The two adults began signing to each other with sudden urgency, their rough, homegrown language snapping back and forth in sharp gestures. Margaret could follow none of it, but the frantic rhythm alone carried the weight of panic. Then she heard it, a sound cut through the mountain stillness, thin, ragged, and unmistakable. A child was crying somewhere behind the house. But it wasn't a normal cry. It was a raw, wordless wail, a sound of pain, so deep it seemed to strip language away. "There's another child back there," Dr. Martinez said, her voice tight and certain. "We need to see all of them." Margaret quickly wrote the words on her notepad. "We need to see all your children. We are here to help." Ray read the message. His face blanched, then hardened. He spun toward Betty Hans, flashing with agitated signs. She answered with equal urgency. Without another glance at the visitors, Ray turned and started toward the rear of the house, as if hoping to draw them away from whatever was making that terrible sound. But Dr. Martinez was already moving. Medical instinct overrode every thought of protocol or privacy. The cry of a suffering child was command enough. Margaret followed close behind. What they found in the backyard would stay with them for the rest of their lives. At the edge of the clearing squatted a crude wooden structure, something between a chicken coop and a doghouse. Inside, half hidden in the dim light, crouched another child. He looked perhaps 6 years old, but his body told a different story, a story of generations collapsing inward. His head was grotesquely enlarged, swollen to nearly 3 times normal size. Both eyes were blanked by cloudy cataracts, rendering him blind as well as deaf. His limbs were twisted and shrunken, useless for walking or even sitting upright, and his spine curved so sharply that he was folded nearly double. Ropes, rough, frayed and knotted, kept him bound inside the enclosure. The smell of confinement and decay seeped from the boards. "My God," Dr. Martinez whispered, "he's being kept like an animal." The child sensed their presence and began that awful wordless keening again. Communication reduced to raw sound. Ray Whittaker appeared beside them, his face a turbulent mix of shame and stubborn defiance. He signed rapidly, desperate to explain or excuse what they were seeing. Margaret scrawled a question. "How long has he been like this?" Ray read, then slowly raised both hands, 10 fingers, then repeated the gesture twice more. 30. 30 months. No, 30 years. Dr. Martinez crouched to peer inside professional composure, barely masking horror. "This is criminal neglect," she said softly. "We need to get him out of here now." Footsteps crunched behind them. Tom Bradley and Detective Thompson rounded the corner, their faces blanching as they took in the sight. Jesus Christ, the detective breathed. What the hell is this? This, Dr. Martinez answered grimly, is what 11 generations of deliberate inbreeding can produce. She angled a small flashlight over the child, voice clinical but trembling. Massive hydrocephalus probably caused by a Dandy Walker malformation. Bilateral cataracts. Severe spina bifida with near total paralysis. Multiple limb deformities. Profound intellectual disability is almost certain. In plain English, Tom said, his voice barely steady. This child was born with brain damage so severe he will never function on his own. He can't see, can't hear, can't walk, can't speak, and may not even comprehend what's happening around him. They've kept him in this cage because they don't know any other way to keep him alive. Margaret felt the ground sway beneath her. How is he even still alive? She asked. That's the mystery, Dr. Martinez replied. Children with this level of genetic damage usually don't survive infancy. Someone has been caring for him poorly, but enough to keep him alive. Ray remained beside the coup's shoulders, slumped under a weight no explanation could lift. Margaret wrote another question. Are there more children? Panic flickered across Ray's face. He glanced toward the house, then back to his wife. Betty appeared a moment later carrying a small child Margaret didn't recognize. At first, Margaret thought it was the youngest she'd seen on her first visit. But as Betty stepped closer, dread settled over her. This was a different child entirely. Perhaps 4 years old, yet so developmentally stunted he couldn't support his own weight. Dr. Martinez turned sharply to Ray. How many children do you have? Margaret translated in writing. Ray slowly raised his hands and extended 7 fingers. 7. Margaret had seen 4 on her first visit. Now, 2 more stood revealed in the yard. And still, 1 remained unaccounted for. That left 1 child unaccounted for. As if reading her thoughts, Tom Bradley pointed toward a small rise of earth near the back fence. It was too symmetrical to be natural, too carefully shaped to be anything other than, "Oh no," Margaret whispered. Dr. Martinez followed her gaze and understood instantly. "Ray?" she called softly, pointing toward the mound. Then she wrote a single word in her notebook. "Baby." Ray's face broke. His shoulders sagged and he nodded once. Then he raised 1 finger and drew a slow, deliberate slash across his throat. 1 child had not survived. Silence closed over the yard, broken only by the keening of the child, still confined inside the wooden pen. Margaret forced herself to look around. 6 living children, all deaf, all visibly disabled. All the fragile products of 11 generations of intentional inbreeding. And 1 tiny grave marking the price of a bloodline's obsession. "We're taking them," Dr. Martinez said, suddenly her voice iron. "Every single child needs medical care now. You can't just take them," Tom Bradley countered. "We need court orders, evaluations." "Look around you," Martinez snapped. "That child is tied up in a cage. The parents are siblings. This is the most extreme case of genetic abuse in American history. We are not leaving them here 1 more day." Detective Thompson was already on his radio. "We'll need multiple ambulances," he said into the receiver, his voice taut. "And a specialized transport for the most critical child." Margaret watched the parents cling to one another, signing frantically in their rough language. Their faces flickered between panic and something unexpected relief. as if part of them had longed for someone to uncover their secret and take away the unbearable burden they had been commanded to carry. What had begun as a simple anonymous tip about deaf children had unveiled something far darker. The Whitaker children were not merely deaf. They were living evidence of what happens when religious fanaticism and genetic ignorance are allowed to feed each other for more than 2 centuries. Margaret stood frozen as medical teams began the careful, almost reverent process of freeing the most severely disabled child from his wooden prison. If Dr. Martinez's calculations were correct, some of these children might not survive much longer. The Whitaker family's 200-year experiment in divine purity was collapsing. But for the innocent lives caught inside it, the damage might already be irreversible. The first distant wail of an ambulance siren broke the Appalachian quiet. 11 generations of silence were ending. But for the Whitaker children, their real journey was only beginning. 3 weeks later, the Kentucky State Archives in Frankfort became the unlikely center of an unprecedented research project. Within its hushed reading rooms, Dr. Martinez convened a team of geneticists, historians, and genealogists to trace the Whitaker bloodline from its roots. What they uncovered in brittle church registers and forgotten county ledgers would redefine the limits of religious extremism in America. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a genealogist from the University of Kentucky, spread a massive family tree across the conference table. This was no rough sketch like the one Tom Bradley had carried weeks before. This was the complete reconstruction of 11 generations of deliberate genetic isolation. I need to warn you. Harper began, her voice carrying the weary gravity of someone who has spent weeks staring into human darkness. What we found isn't just inbreeding. It is a carefully maintained program of genetic control that stretches back more than 2 centuries. Margaret Chen sat at the far end of the table, the images of the Whitaker children still haunting her mind. The most severely deformed child, the one found bound in the wooden coop, had died just 5 days after rescue. His body was simply too damaged to survive beyond the controlled world that had sustained him. Start from the beginning, Dr. Martinez said quietly. We need to understand how this happened. Harper pointed to the top of the tree, where a single name was written in bold, Jeremiah Whitaker. Jeremiah was more than a patriarch. He was the founder and spiritual architect of a sect known as the Holy Brethren of Pure Blood. From a leather-bound diary unearthed in a defunct Virginia church, Harper read aloud an entry dated 1783. The Lord has revealed to me the sacred truth that His chosen people must remain pure in blood and spirit. The corruption of mixing with foreign seed will damn our children to eternal suffering. We must preserve the divine essence that flows through our veins even unto the 7th generation and beyond. Foreign seed, Detective Thompson repeated, meaning anyone outside the family. Exactly, Harper confirmed. Jeremiah taught that the Whitaker blood carried divine essence that outsiders would corrupt. He didn't merely forbid outside marriages, he arranged unions between siblings and first cousins to keep the bloodline pure. Dr. Martinez studied the chart, her medical eye tracing each line of descent. The genetic consequences would have been obvious within 2 generations, she said. Birth defects, deafness, cognitive disorders. They saw them. Harper interrupted grimly and celebrated them. She opened another document, a brittle doctrinal record of the Holy Brethren, written in Jeremiah's own hand. When the Lord marks His chosen children with special signs, difficulty in hearing His voice, faces or bodies set apart from the corrupt world, we rejoice. These are the marks of divine separation from the fallen masses. Margaret felt her stomach twist. What science called deformity, Jeremiah Whittaker had preached as proof of heavenly favor. They didn't merely accept the disabilities, Dr. Harper continued, her voice low and deliberate. They celebrated them as proof of holiness. Each new generation that carried more pronounced deformities was believed to be closer to God. The genealogist turned to the second branch of the massive family tree. Jeremiah Whittaker, she said, tapping the parchment, had 7 children with his wife Sarah. When those children came of age, he arranged what he called divine marriages pairings, chosen for spiritual compatibility, not health. Her finger slid to the first of many unsettling unions. His eldest son Samuel married his own sister Rebecca. The results were catastrophic. We found a birth record from 1805. Samuel and Rebecca produced 9 children. 3 died before their first breath. Of the 6 who survived, 4 displayed severe developmental disabilities. 1 was born without the ability to speak. Another was born blind. 2 more showed what we would now recognize as profound intellectual impairment. Dr. Martinez asked quietly, and the family's response. They celebrated, Harper said flatly. Church records show Jeremiah declaring that his grandchildren were approaching a divine state, that their afflictions were evidence of heavenly favor. Detective Thompson scribbled furiously. So these weren't problems to be solved? They were religious achievements. Exactly. Harper's hand moved to the 3rd generation. By 1830, the pattern was fixed. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces. First cousins produced children who then married their own first cousins. She pointed to a small cluster of names. This generation produced the first documented cases of congenital deafness, twin brothers Ezekiel and Isaiah Whittaker, both born completely deaf. Instead of seeing this as a genetic warning, the family claimed it was a sign of divine wisdom. Deafness, they said, allowed the boys to hear only God's silent voice. Martinez exhaled sharply. They built a theology around disability. More than that, Harper replied. They built a breeding program. She traced the ink to generation 4. Here the pattern becomes even more deliberate. Ezekiel and Isaiah, the deaf twins, were each married to their own sisters. The pairings were selected based on physical traits. They weren't just marrying relatives, they were attempting to engineer holiness. Dr. Martinez's brow furrowed as she calculated silently. The inbreeding coefficient by generation 4 would have been astronomical, she murmured. Genetic damage at that level should have made reproduction nearly impossible. And yet, Harper said, they continued. Generation 4 produced 43 children. Only 17 survived to adulthood. Of those, 1712 were either deaf-blind or severely impaired. She moved to generation 5. By 1870, they introduced what they called sacred mathematics, a system of symbols and calculations, to determine which relatives should reproduce together to produce the most blessed offspring. Detective Thompson frowned. Sacred mathematics. Harper unfolded a fragile sheet covered in hand-drawn symbols. They were trying to maximize genetic damage. They believed the more profound the disability, the closer the child stood to heaven. Margaret stared at the page, struggling to comprehend the logic that had driven more than a century of deliberate suffering. They weren't merely accepting disabled children, Harper said softly. They were attempting to create a new form of human being, one they believed would exist closer to God because it was separated from the ordinary world by physical and mental barriers. The genealogist turned the page to Generation 6. By 1890, they were keeping meticulous records of each child's traits. This ledger from Patriarch Jaya Whittaker lists every birth, every defect, every sign of what they called sacred distinction. Dr. Martinez scanned the cramped handwriting. They were tracking heritable traits across generations. This is sophisticated genetic record-keeping decades before modern genetics even existed, sophisticated Detective Thompson said grimly, and monstrous. Harper's finger moved to Generation 7. This is where we see the first universal appearance of deafness. Every child born in this generation was completely deaf. Rather than recognize it as a catastrophe, the family celebrated it as the ultimate achievement of divine silence. According to their doctrine, a deaf child could hear only the voice of God, undistracted by the fallen world. By Generation 8, the damage was nearly total. Mortality rates climbed to nearly 60%, Harper explained. Most children died before the age of 5. Those who survived suffered layers of disabilities, deafness, blindness, intellectual impairment, severe physical deformities. And yet, the family saw each death not as tragedy, but as spiritual refinement. How did they justify so much suffering? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They didn't see it as suffering, Harper replied. They believed each generation was moving closer to transcendence. To them, death and deformity were proof of transformation. Harper shifted to Generation 9. By the mid-20th century, the Whittakers had withdrawn completely from society. No doctors, no schools, no government records. They moved deep into the Kentucky mountains and severed every tie to the outside world. Detective Thompson nodded. That's when they disappeared from census data. Exactly, Harper said. And it's when they began their final phase. Her hand hovered over Generation 10. The parents of the current children, Betty and Ray, were themselves the products of the most extreme unions yet. Their parents were brother and sister first cousins, and uncle and niece simultaneously. The genetic relationships are so entangled, they defy simple description. Dr. Martinez scanned the figures with growing horror. The inbreeding coefficient for their offspring would exceed 0.4. That's higher than the most controlled laboratory strains of animals. And it shows, Harper said grimly. Betty and Ray both display classic signs of extreme inbreeding: universal deafness, cognitive impairment, skeletal deformities. Finally, Harper reached the bottom of the tree, Generation 11. This is the end of the line. The children you found are the inevitable result of 2 centuries of deliberate genetic isolation. Universal deafness, profound intellectual disability, multiple congenital defects, immune system collapse, lifespans shortened to a fraction of normal. They can't reproduce, Margaret said softly. The males are almost certainly sterile, Dr. Martinez confirmed. Even if the females could conceive, the genetic damage would make miscarriage or infant death nearly inevitable. Harper closed the ledger with a careful finality. What we are looking at is not merely inbreeding, she said. It is the most extreme case of intentional genetic manipulation ever documented, a family systematically dismantling its own humanity in the name of purity. Detective Thompson let out a slow breath, and in a terrible way, he said they succeeded. They created exactly what they sought: children separated from the normal world by silence and suffering. Margaret thought of the Whitaker children now receiving medical care, their lives barely beginning beyond the boundaries of their mountain home. The irony struck like a quiet thunderclap. Their so-called divine silence was not a gift from heaven at all. It was the sound of a bloodline collapsing under the weight of its own obsession. The children could not hear the outside world. They could not understand it. They could not interact with it in any way most of us would call normal. They lived in a silent, sealed reality, an existence apart. Dr. Martinez gathered the medical files in front of her, the papers trembling just slightly in her hands. The saddest part, she said softly, is that none of this can be undone. Even with every modern treatment, most of these children will never live on their own. The genetic damage is too deep. As the meeting adjourned, Margaret lingered staring at the blank family charts and photographs scattered across the table. What began 2 centuries earlier as a quest for divine purity had ended in children who were scarcely recognizable as human. The Whitaker family's self-described experiment in holy bloodlines was finally broken, but its consequences would echo through the hills of eastern Kentucky for generations, a permanent warning of what happens when religious fervor collides with genetic ignorance. And somewhere in those same misted mountains, Dr. Martinez suspected other isolated families might still be following similar creeds of secrecy and suffering, creating their own versions of the Whitaker children's silent world. Weeks later, in a small interview room prepared by the Kentucky Department for Community-Based Services, state investigators attempted something unprecedented, a formal interrogation of Betty and Ray Whitaker. Patricia Nolan, a specialist in communicating with the profoundly deaf, sat across from the couple. With writing pads, picture cards, and a video camera, ready to capture every fragment of their primitive sign language. 3 weeks had passed since the children were taken into protective care. This would be the first real attempt to understand what the parents believed and why. Dr. Nolan began with simple, carefully written questions in bold, clear letters. Do you understand why your children were taken away? Betty and Ray exchanged quick glances, their hands moving in that sharp, agitated sign Margaret had first witnessed at their home. The gestures carried fear, but also something stranger, a confusion that seemed utterly sincere. Finally, Betty reached for the pen and scrawled in shaky letters, "Children blessed." Why take blessed ones? From behind the one-way mirror, Margaret read the words in a whisper. Blessed. She thinks their disabilities are blessings. Dr. Nolan kept her tone neutral as she wrote her next question. What do you mean by blessed? This time Ray took the pen, his handwriting even more strained than his wife's. Marked by God, closer to heaven. Pure blood makes holy children. In the observation room, the clinical team exchanged horrified glances. Dr. Martinez shook her head slowly. They truly believe the genetic damage is a sign of divine favor. Nolan pressed on. Who taught you that disabled children are blessed? Betty wrote with deliberate care. Father taught, grandfather taught, great-grandfather taught. Always know truth. How many generations has your family believed this? Ray struggled to grasp the idea of counting generations, then finally wrote, always, since great-great-great-grandfather Jeremiah. He saw God's truth. Dr. Nolan needed to understand their relationships to make sense of the doctrine. How are you and Betty related? The question seemed to confuse them. They signed back and forth for a long moment before Ray finally wrote, Betty is wife. Betty is sister. Betty is cousin. Family is one. Margaret felt a wave of nausea. They did not even recognize that being siblings and spouses was anything but normal. Who decided you should marry Betty Nolan? Asked next. Ray's answer came without hesitation. Father decided. Father knew God's will. Betty chosen for pure blood. What is pure blood? Betty's reply was firm, almost proud. Blood not poisoned by strangers. Whitaker blood is God's blood. Mixing with outsiders makes evil children. Dr. Martinez scribbled notes, her face drawn tight. This isn't mere ignorance, she murmured. It's a fully formed theology. Nolan carefully posed one final question. Do you know why your children cannot hear? The parents' answer chilled the room. Children hear God better because they not hear world. Deaf children most blessed. They hear only heaven. What about the child who died? Was he blessed too? Betty's face collapsed into grief as she wrote, Baby too blessed for world. God took him to heaven early. He was most pure. Ray added a final line in trembling script. Baby had biggest blessing, head full of God's wisdom, too much for Earth's body. Dr. Nolan set down her pen, the interview room suddenly heavy with silence. The couple had interpreted even their child's death as proof of holiness. In their minds, suffering was not tragedy, it was triumph. And in that quiet, Margaret understood the full horror, for the Whitakers' love itself had been twisted into a ritual of harm generation after generation, until silence became their only inheritance. The more severe the disability, the more blessed the child was believed to be. That was the first thing Dr. Nolan had to understand before she could even begin the next round of questions. How do you decide which family members should marry? She wrote in slow, deliberate letters. Ray's answer came without hesitation, his hands trembling as he gripped the pen. Father teaches sacred numbers, count blessings in children. Marry most blessed to most blessed, makes more blessed babies. Sacred numbers. Betty leaned forward, eager to clarify. Count deaf children. Count special head size. Count different body parts. More different is more blessed. Use numbers to pick wives and husbands. Dr. Martinez scribbled furiously in her notebook. They've created a scoring system for genetic abnormalities, she whispered. They're literally trying to maximize birth defects. Dr. Nolan shifted the questioning toward their isolation. Why does your family live away from other people? Betty's eyes hardened as she wrote, Other people have poison blood. They not understand God's blessings. They think blessed children are sick. We keep family safe from world lies. Do you want your children to marry people outside the family? Both parents reacted with visible horror. Ray scrawled quickly, his letters jagged with urgency. No, no, no. Outside marriage makes cursed children. Children hear too much world noise. Children not blessed. Family duty to keep blood pure. Dr. Nolan paused, then asked the question that hovered over every exchange. What will happen to your children now? Betty's response was heartbreaking in its certainty. World will poison children. Doctors will try to make children hear world instead of God. Children will lose blessings. Children will go to hell. Ray added his own warning. Doctors are servants of devil. They want to make blessed children normal. Normal is cursed. Normal means hearing world lies instead of God's truth. Nolan kept her expression neutral, though the observation room behind the glass had gone completely silent. Do you know, you are different from most people? Betty's reply came with quiet pride. We are more blessed than most people. We hear God better. We're not distracted by world noise. Our bodies show God's special marks. Do you wish you could hear? Betty's face softened with something almost like pity. Hearing world sounds is curse. Hearing makes people think about world instead of God. Deaf is gift from God. Nolan shifted gently to the realities of daily life. How do you care for children who cannot walk or feed themselves? Betty's answer was written with reverent steadiness. God provides strength. Most blessed children need most care. Caring for blessed children is sacred duty. Makes parents more holy. What about the child we found tied up outside? Ray's expression remained calm, untroubled. Joshua too blessed to walk. We keep Joshua safe. Joshua head so full of God's wisdom, he not need to move. We protect Joshua from falling. From the observation room, Dr. Martinez murmured, they truly believe they're protecting him. They don't understand they're causing harm. Nolan pressed on. Did any of your children ever seem to be in pain? Betty shook her head and wrote, blessed children not feel pain like world children. Their bodies are different. Pain is world thing. Blessed children feel only God's love. What if doctors could help your children here? The question sent both parents into visible panic. Betty's hand raced across the page. No help. Hearing is curse. Children perfect the way God made them. Doctors want to make children evil. Ray added urgently. If children hear, they will hear devil's lies. They will want to leave family. They will lose blessing. They will go to hell. Nolan tried a different approach. Do you plan to have more children? Ray's response was calm, almost serene. God will decide. If God gives more children, we will raise them pure. Hope for more blessed children. More deaf is better. What if your children wanted to marry outsiders? Betty's eyes flashed with sudden certainty. Children will not want that. We teach children truth. Outside marriage is sin. Makes cursed babies. Children will choose pure marriage when old enough. Do you know why children of related parents have problems? Ray frowned, confused by the word problems, and finally wrote, children of related parents have blessings, not problems. Problems come from mixing pure blood with poison blood. Related parents make purest children. For 3 relentless hours, the questioning continued, every answer reinforcing the same closed loop of belief. Medical care, education, interaction with the outside world, all were seen as threats to God's design. Every disability was celebrated as proof of holiness. Every suggestion of normality was condemned as sin. Finally, Dr. Allen posed the question no one else dared to ask. if you could change anything about your children, what would it be? Betty and Ray signed to each other for a long, heavy silence before Betty wrote their final response. Only wish children were more blessed. Wish they could not see world at all. Wish their bodies were more different. Wish they were closer to God. The interview ended in a silence more unsettling than any scream. Behind the glass, the observation team sat motionless, struggling to process what they had just heard. Parents who genuinely believed that severe genetic damage was not a tragedy, but the highest form of love. Dr. Martinez spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. They're not evil in the way we usually understand it. They're victims people shaped by 11 generations of conditioning. They literally cannot comprehend that they've been harming their children. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the couple still seated across the table. To them, she said, "We are the monsters. We took away their blessed children. We're trying to curse them with normal hearing and ordinary lives." Dr. Nolan gathered her notes with a trembling hand. "The most disturbing part," she said quietly, "is how logical it all becomes once you accept their first premise. If genetic deformity truly meant divine favor, then every decision they made, every marriage, every child, makes perfect, terrible sense." Detective Thompson, silent until now, exhaled and stared through the glass. "The question is," he said, "what do we do with parents who honestly believed they were doing the right thing, even when the result is this?" As the team left the room, Margaret found herself walking more slowly than the others, her thoughts heavy. Betty and Ray Whitaker were not sadists. They were not killers in the ordinary sense. They were people who had been born into a world where love meant harm, where suffering was holiness, and where silence was the only sound of God. There is a secret that has been dormant for more than a century, hidden in the misty Appalachian Mountains. A secret that, if you hadn't read the surviving documents yourself, you probably wouldn't believe it ever happened. Are you ready to hear this story? Let your mind drift slowly with each breath, because what is about to be told may make you both shiver and wonder about the limits of science and faith. In the old records, people found the name Dr. Friedrich Kellner, a German scientist who immigrated to America in the late 19th century. He ran a place called the Kellner Institute, but on paper, no one knows exactly what kind of facility it was. Behind closed doors, Kellner conducted what he called genetic modification experiments, a phrase that sounds modern, but was actually written in the 1880s. Have you ever thought that right here in America more than 100 years ago, someone was secretly interfering with the human genome? As the investigation team opened each file, the truth appeared in cold slices. Dr. Kellner did not just observe nature. He deliberately introduced genetic mutations into isolated families in Appalachia. They did not just create deaf children. He also introduced other strange characteristics: abnormally large skulls, bone deformities, nerve damage. Each piece planted into the bloodline like mysterious marks. Can you imagine how the investigation team felt when they saw the genetic analysis? Each milestone was clearly marked: 1889, one mutation, 1903 another, then 1909 another deformity. It wasn't random. It was step-by-step, experiment by experiment over generations. But the most chilling thing was how Kellner found willing families. He chose isolated religious communities where people believed that unusual children were the mark of God. In his 1895 diary, Kellner wrote, the Appalachian subjects proved ideal for long-term study. Their religious faith made them willing to undergo genetic modification, and their isolation ensured that the mutations would be preserved unadulterated. We are making the first controlled experiments in human breeding in the history of science. Do you hear that? The tone of the words was a cold boast, and families like Whitaker were the canvas on which Kellner painted his scientific dream. The deformities that the world looked at with pity were in their eyes a divine blessing. They paid themselves more than $30,000 at that time, a huge fortune, for Kellner and his colleagues to give new mutations. The more unusual each child, the closer they believed they were to God. Do you feel a chill when you think that parents themselves begged to experiment on their own children? When Kellner died in 1923, the story should have ended. But it didn't. His students and colleagues continued to watch in secret. Medical reports from the 1940s and 1950s still meticulously recorded each Whitaker child, each case of deformity in the Morrison-Hartwell Blackwood families. A network of secrecy was built not only to preserve the reputation of the mountain region, but also to protect the ongoing experiments. Stop for a moment and think how many doctors, officials, and scholars had to keep silent to let this continue for 150 years. And then, the final discovery left the entire lab breathless. The changes Kellner created were not accidental. The hearing loss, the large skulls, the different neural structures, all were designed to achieve a single goal, creating people with psychic abilities. Dr. Martinez pointed to the brain graphs of the Whitaker children abnormally synchronized. Brain waves, ancient brain regions, suddenly active the ability to communicate without sound. Not a consequence, but an expected result. Kellner believed that by stripping away normal senses and re-engineering the brain, he could create spiritual beings, people who could perceive a world we could never touch. Do you believe in psychic abilities? Or do you just think it's a form of brain that science has yet to name? In a letter to the Whitaker family in 1920, Kellner wrote, "After 30 years of genetic modification, your family is reaching its goal. The children now live largely in the spirit realm with little connection to the material world. They represent the next stage of evolution, beings who can perceive divine truth directly without the need for ordinary senses." Reading those lines, do you feel the line between science and fanaticism suddenly blur? Finally, the investigation team could only remain silent, because the truth was too obvious and too terrible. The Whitakers were not simply the product of superstitious inbreeding. They were living experiments, the result of a plan that lasted more than a century to create a new kind of human, beings that existed in the silence between the material and spiritual worlds. The children are still there, 4 little souls living in a silence we cannot understand. They are proof of a question that has yet to be answered. Are some doors of science never meant to be opened? What do you think, knowing that perhaps somewhere in the mists of Appalachia, there are still descendants carrying within them the changes Dr. Kellner planted? Are they hearing things we can never hear? Or are we, with our normal hearing, the ones who are blind to another world? Close your eyes, let that question float in your mind. Because there are secrets, even when told, that can only be heard with the heart, never explained by reason.